She stopped in her tracks, purposefully shuffled her feet 2 feet to the right, and smashed her heels smack dab center in Putin's face. Then she kept on walking. Up next on the Crossing Ideas podcast. Welcome to the Crossing Ideas podcast. I'm Mark Sasse, playwright fortunate enough to win some awards, author of 13 novels, including the soon-to-be-released Lady Trieu and the Demon Warrior of Hanoi. Modern Hanoi has been occupied by the Chinese for 2 years. Their only hope is looking to the past and summoning an ancient warrior once again. Look for this contemporary fantasy later this fall. You can check out all my works at mwsasse.com. That's www.mwsasse.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, look for listener support on Spotify as a great way to support future episodes. The purpose of the Crossing Ideas podcast is to look at the issues of today through the lens of a lifetime of international living. Season 2, Episode 2. Stalin's printing press and Putin's face. In the center of Tbilisi, the capital city of the Republic of Georgia, along the Kura River, is a lovely little park. In the park, you can catch a cable car up to the top of the mountain across the river, above Old Town, where the ancient fortress watches over the sleepy city. Also in the park, you can grab a hot dog from a stand or catch a tethered air balloon ride straight up into the sky for a fantastic view of the city. In a certain corner of the park, overlooking the modern lighted walking bridge called the Bridge of Peace, which crosses the river, sits a bench. And on that bench is a sitting statue of Ronald Reagan, former U.S. president. He has his left arm out over the back of the bench, so a passerby could snuggle up with Ronnie and maybe ask him if he had any jelly beans. It's a great picturesque spot. But a statue of Ronald Reagan in a park in Tbilisi, Georgia? It was an amazing, unexpected find. Why? Why is there a Reagan statue there? We'll get back to that. As I mentioned in episode 1, Tbilisi first came into my consciousness when I was taking a class on Stalin for my second master's degree. I had discovered that Joseph Stalin, who was born Yosob Besonarius ze Yusovil, I know that I'm completely butchering that, okay? He was born a Georgian, and that was his name, even though the way I said it was not his name. But when translated over to Russian, was commonly known as Joseph Stalin. Now, he wasn't born in Tbilisi. He was born in the Georgian town of Gori, a couple hours northwest of Tbilisi. On my second trip to Tbilisi in March of 2022, I hired a taxi for the day to take me to Gori so I could visit the Stalin Museum. Gori is an old town with a fortress of its own. The Stalin Museum was built in a majestic old-world building, not quite modern like the Smithsonian. There's a dark entrance with huge, wide steps leading up to the first landing with a large, foreboding statue of the man himself. There was a room with his desk, his uniform, photographs of Stalin with many world leaders. There was a bust of Franklin D. Roosevelt, embodying the time when the unlikely forces of the Americans and Russian communists united against Nazi Germany. Outside the museum, they have preserved Stalin's actual birthplace, a small wooden cabin, and they built an ornate Greek-pillared structure around it. Beside the museum is Stalin's railroad coach, which I walked through. It was clearly from the 1950s and probably was luxurious in its day. But it felt about as luxurious as a disregarded and irrelevant dictator from the past, abandoned with a thin veneer of luster which once commanded respect and authority, but now sits as a reminder of a past long gone. It's difficult to overstate Stalin's influence over the 20th century. From his ascension through the communist ranks after Lenin's death, to becoming a brutal dictator who oversaw the political purges and the disastrous agricultural programs which killed millions of Russians, to his commitment to defeat Nazi Germany during the war, to his iron grip on Eastern Europe, creating the Iron Curtain, annexing many countries to make sure what happened during the war would never happen again. He oversaw the Soviets' influence in China as Mao Zedong led the communist Chinese to victory in 1949. All of his power and authority was built on his foundational years in his home of Georgia. One of the more remarkable historical sites I've ever visited is almost a forgotten place in Tbilisi, Stalin's underground printing press. I finally visited it on my third trip to Tbilisi in October of 2022. There's a great little museum which highlights Stalin's career. There's even a Soviet-era decorative desk you can sit behind and grab a snapshot while holding a 50s-era phone and feel like you're a Soviet king calling Fidel Castro to see how the revolution is going and to order a box of Cuban cigars at the same time. But the piece de resistance is the underground printing press. Stalin and the anti-Russian Tsar's activists around 1903 to 1906 built a modest house in what was at the time the outskirts of Tbilisi. But what was not obvious is that nearly 50 feet below the house were dug out hidden rooms where a printing press was set up for the activist propaganda. They dug a deep well, but down near the surface of the water was a hidden opening which led to a small tunnel and the only entrance to the remarkable place where the printing press was hidden. The local authorities were having fits trying to figure out where all this contraband propaganda was coming from. They suspected the house for a long time, as 2 women lived there as a front. How did they discover it? On a whim. A Georgian police officer lit something on fire and threw it into the well. When a gust of air at the bottom of the well blew it out, they knew there was an opening down there. They descended and found the printing press, destroyed it, arrested the culprits, and that was that. So they thought. Back in the late 1950s, the Georgian authorities opened up the underground printing press for the public. No, you don't have to crawl down a well to get in. They built a steep metal spiral staircase down into the depths of the ground and created an opening into the secret printing room. I climbed down those same rickety steps and made it inside the room. One of the old printing presses remained, and I could picture the images in my mind, a young Stalin busy with a group of activists, churning out posters and papers nonstop, anti-Tsarist propaganda, which would eventually help fuel the Bolshevik Revolution a decade later. I poked my head in the original hole in the wall, which led down to the opening in the well. It creeped me out, for sure. What circumstances would have led me to go underground to do a crazy illegal activity because of the ideal I held deeply within me? To me, it was a great illustration about activism, how ideology can overtake one's mind to such a degree that you would do anything for the cause, whatever it is. It made me think about the causes of this day and age, which people go to extremes for. Climate change. Those who would throw soup on pieces of art, or who would stop traffic or chain themselves to a tree or whatever in order to make a statement. Activism hasn't changed, just the ideology, just the causes. It's a strange phenomenon to have a local famous son who is also associated with so much evil. To have an older Georgian population who might, especially in Gori, the town of Gori, who might still have some nostalgic feelings for the Soviet era. But Stalin has largely become a symbol of Soviet domination, of the time period when they weren't free. So at first chance, the Georgians seceded from the Soviets in 1991. And this brings me back to the woman who smashed her heel in Putin's face. As I mentioned before, I traveled to Tbilisi for the second time in March 2022, just a couple of weeks after Putin and the Russian army declared war on Ukraine. As the whole world was feeling outrage against the Russian aggression, the people of Georgia felt it a little stronger. I quickly discovered the overwhelming sentiment of the people of Tbilisi. There were signs everywhere, F Putin. On the sidewalks, they had attached large stickers of Putin's face, and as I described already, pedestrians would change direction and go out of their way just so they could step right on Putin's face, usually while yelling a Georgian slur to go with it. The Georgian financial institutions had stopped taking the Russian rubles at the time. On the money exchange boards, you could see RUB 0.00. And each night, outside the Parliament building on the broad Rustaveli Avenue just past Freedom Square, the demonstrations would begin. One night, I found myself caught in the middle of one. The wide avenue had been closed and thousands upon thousands of people jammed the street and the open area in front of Parliament. There were places where people could leave donations, and there were loudspeakers and roaring and people yelling, and I slowly squeezed myself through the crowd, curious for sure. It's the atmosphere I would assume what a revolution would feel like. The energy pulsed through the crowd. There was passion, solidarity, and their unequivocal condemnation of Putin's actions. I was intrigued by the atmosphere, but a little apprehensive, not sure if it meant anything to have an American caught up in such a display. So I kept moving and weaved through the crowd until the ranks thinned out. But the entire length of the street was closed and more people streamed towards the mob to make their own stand. It wasn't long ago that Russia had invaded Georgia and had annexed a certain region, calling it their own. So the aggression against Ukraine felt personal to the Georgian people. They had been dominated by the Soviets, by the Russians, much of it because of one of their own native sons. And even though the Soviet era is long past, the reminders remain, and the great ferocious bear to their north is always present and is always a threat. And their incursion into Ukraine is simply a reminder of the reality of their existence in the luscious Caucasus region of Eastern Europe. So as I walked through the park one day and stumbled upon the statue of Ronald Reagan, it made complete sense to me. Georgians get it. On the statue is this inscription, one of Ronald Reagan's most famous quotes: "Freedom is never more than one generation from extinction." So when many politicos scoffed at Reagan in 1987, when he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate, which led to oppressed East Berlin, and said those iconic words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," that was not just the sentiment of the United States. That was not just the sentiment of a single American president. That was not just the sentiment of the West Germans. That was the sentiment of the Georgian people as well, who longed to finally have self-governance once again. I want to leave you with Reagan's entire quote. Quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to live in the United States where men were free. I hope us Americans will remember it as much as the Georgians of the Caucasus Mountains do." This is Mark Sasse. Thanks for listening to the Crossing Ideas podcast. Up next in Season 2, Episode 3, I'm going back to my roots in Pennsylvania to discuss oil. That's right, when Western Pennsylvania was the oil capital of the world. Next time on the Crossing Ideas podcast. Remember to like, follow, and share so others can find this podcast as well. Check out listener support on Spotify, and don't forget, check out my books on Amazon or at www.mwsasse.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.